Good day to you all. This is the GTM AI podcast. Episode number 26 with Kevin DePopas joins me to discuss how GTM teams are using AI in a secure and scalable way with Liminal. This is sponsored by the GTM AI Academy, your go-to source for learning how to use AI in companies, teams, and in your individual workflow. Business impact over learning tools.
Hello, welcome, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I am Coach K, and I finally, after I think a couple times having to reschedule, have Kevin. But first off, thank you, my man. So good to finally have you. How are you?
Yeah, doing great. Yeah, I'm glad to finally be on here after coordinating schedules. So
all this stuff, I know. So Kevin and I had the privilege of connecting a couple different times, and the last couple times we did, I'm like, I got to get you on for the podcast because your company Liminal is doing something really unique, really freaking cool. And it goes down into, I told you this before, when I think about how to employ an AI enablement strategy or AI strategy in general, as far as the usage for the entire team, a company like Liminal is key. And then just you as a person are just like the coolest cat in the world. So I just had to have both the lens from your company, just you specifically. So I'm really glad you had a chance. So what I'd love to do is have you talk about your journey first. What's the stuff that's not on LinkedIn? How in the world did you get to the point where you're with Liminal and in this crazy AI space, and what kind of led you to where you are?
yeah, great questions. I guess I'll go all the way back. Went to university at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And after school, I focused on, I had a degree in consulting or business, but with a focus in consulting. That led me down to Atlanta to work for Deloitte Consulting. Met my wife down there, lived in Atlanta for 3.5 years, and then moved out to Denver about 7 years ago. About a year and a half into my Deloitte journey, I decided client service wasn't for me. And I left to start my own company, there's some interesting takeaways from starting a company a year and a half into your career. But yeah, so I ran my own kind of venture-backed healthcare startup for 7.5 years. I installed new management and stepped down from the CEO position last summer, took some time to travel. And then I kid you not, I was like, you know what, on October 1, this is of 2023, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to concertedly start to look for new work. First thing I'm going to do is open up my network. First person I talked to ended up giving me an offer to lead our sales effort at Liminal. So it didn't have too much time between, and now it's like out of the frying pan into the fire type of thing. I find myself back in an early stage startup. So yeah.
That's awesome. I love it. Your official title is head of go-to-market. So you're like the perfect guest for the show because you're go-to-market and you're with an AI platform. So it's awesome. So for those not listening, aren't familiar, give me the spiel. What in the world is Liminal?
Yeah. So Liminal is effectively, we keep sensitive data, PHI, PII, intellectual property out of large language models. The goal being, let's actually find a way to put generative AI in the hands of employees without having to compromise on security. So I think we're all aware of the transformational power of generative AI when applied to the workforce, where we sell into kind of large regulated enterprise. I don't want to say large. Our pipeline right now is definitely slanted towards the large tens of thousands of employees, large enterprise, especially in the regulated space. I think banking, healthcare, insurance, advanced manufacturing, organizations that house true regulated data. So for these organizations, despite the benefit and the productivity gains that can be achieved by implementing generative AI, they're terrified that their average business user is going to either accidentally or unknowingly copy and paste or type sensitive information into these LLMs, creating either a regulatory or compliance violation, or just any business has intellectual property, trade secrets, et cetera, that they don't want to find their way in. And so there's a lot of opacity about once this data goes in, how does it come back out and how can that hurt me? And so that's the category we sell into.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times when I talk to someone, because in the academy, I work with both teams and then individuals on how to use AI. And there's so many people who say, yeah, I use this on my personal phone, on my personal computer. My company won't let me do it because of all this reason, which is a valid reason. Like having the security, the governance, understanding what in the world's going on is pretty important, but just making sure people don't accidentally do something because it's such a new world. You just don't know what you should be doing. What I love about this is your platform is the key to be able to roll out an entire company. As we've talked to this before, like I see the new world where an entire org, not just revenue, but entire org of accountants and engineers and HR and everybody has access to OpenAI, Claude, whatever. And there's going to be a tool or mechanism to where it's both secure and you can see patterns as a whole of who's prompting, what questions are being
Yep.
asked, what inputs are coming back out, and seeing that. Because right now, I can't do that with ChatGPT
Right.
teams. So
Yep.
tell me
Yep.
more. What are you seeing people when you implement it with people? What kind of use cases and production value are they getting at? Tell me more about what they're seeing as a result.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We have the benefit at Liminal of being able to, in one part, our value proposition is security and compliance. But on the other side of things, we just get to pitch the benefit of generative AI, right? So there's some people who we deploy within these large organizations. They're like, oh my God, this is the most transformative technology. Really, like the question I ask myself is, have you used ChatGPT? Yes, we are a secure way to engage these
Right.
tools. We are not the fundamental model layer. So we're effectively an application middleware that sits in between the person putting in the prompts and the LLM layer. And so we're streaming prompts from numerous data sources through the Liminal engine. We can cleanse those prompts of any sensitive data before passing to any large language model on the back end. So totally model agnostic. And then I think what we do that's really unique is we're able to take the response coming out of the LLM, which is a desensitized response, pass it back through the liminal engine, and then rehydrate that information back into the end user. So it feels like you're truly chatting with a chat interface. You're seeing all the sensitive information in your chat, but we're filtering all that out before it gets to the LLM layer. And so I'd say the biggest thing that I see in the enterprise from, I don't know, a trends standpoint is a lot of large enterprises in the regulated space have said, look, we don't trust our end users to use these tools on their own. So we're going
Right.
to firewall access to generative AI, right? So I go to
Right.
chat.openai.com. A lot of employees are firewalled from that. And that feels like a sensible way to get your arms around the problem and stop people from, leaking information into these systems. But realistically, what's happening is they're just forcing all the traffic onto personal devices. And there's a lot of data to
Mhm.
support that. So Salesforce did a survey of, I think, 14,000 global employees. This was in November of 2023. Happy to
Yep.
send this to you so you can put it in the show notes or whatever. Found that 55% of Gen AI users are using unapproved tools at work. Microsoft just released their annual work trends
Right.
index. That was in the last 2 months. They found
Uh-huh.
that 75% of knowledge workers are using Gen AI at work. 78% of those individuals are bringing their own AI tools to work. So the
Mhm.
takeaway is you can try your darndest to shut down access to these things. But
Yeah,
realistically, what
not
you're
gonna
doing is
happen.
you're actually just you're exacerbating the problem, right? Because then the organization says, how do we taking care of this? We have policies in place. People aren't supposed to use these tools. Our retort is, we want you to trust your employees, but you're placing a lot of faith in them, right? Why not just have a safe and sanctioned sandbox where you can encourage users to use generative AI? You can take a paper policy that largely already exists in most enterprises at this point. If you were to ask
Right.
me this 3 months ago, the answer would not be this, but most organizations have a paper policy. Let's just apply that paper policy systematically using technology. And so that is still like an emerging concept that we have to do a lot of education on, this concept of shadow AI and driving usage off company network.
Yeah. You feel like I've had this conversation many times around founders because I advise a few people and been talking to a bunch on the podcast. It feels like we're in this place where we're fighting against the old way of thinking. That's what we're really going against, is looking at the new way,
Mhm.
which is still being proved out. Like when you hear people talk about it's new to AI, I don't know if I can trust it. So just not even the security layer is the concern. It's more like the trust. How do I trust the
Yep.
AI? What do you say to them as far as that's concerned?
There are some other systems out there that are scanning the responses coming out of LLMs and
Yeah.
gauging whether or not the response is aligned, whether it's accurate. We haven't chosen to focus there
Yep.
because from our account, it seems like the fundamental model providers themselves, that's hallucination is public enemy number one.
Yep.
And just being along this journey, this to be true, like hallucinations have gone down significantly. And from a trust standpoint, I would talk to anybody about trust. And like, it's the same thing as me talking to you and getting advice from you as somebody. Like all the advice coming out of an LLM, everything that comes out, you need to run it through your own filter, right? Like I'm never just
Yep.
taking verbatim what comes out of an LLM and plopping it in a legal document or plopping it in an email. And I think that's where
Right.
what I find interesting is, let's take this out of the context of business. My brother is getting married next week in upstate New York. I'm the officiant of the wedding and also the best.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And there's this kind of like moral ethical dilemma because I'm like, oh man, like I really write a lot better using generative AI to spur ideas and to help. I feel like it gives me a better ability to truly get my voice out into the world. I'm not talking about like just taking it verbatim. It will sound terrible if you take it verbatim. And so if I were to tell somebody that, if I were to tell the audience that I'm officiating to or officiating the wedding to, and said, hey, I heavily use generative AI, and I think a lot of people would say, oh man, that's a cop out. But
Yeah.
how is that any different than me taking something that I've drafted and sending it to my friend who got a degree in creative writing and taking their responses and
Right.
making them my own? Right. And I think that's where, when it comes to trust, whether it comes to creative license, it's on the user to determine how to use these tools. And you're culpable if you put something out there into the world that is inaccurate. That isn't the LLM's fault, in my opinion. So that's going to be there for a while, I think.
I had that same epiphany, like in general, just thinking that me using AI in general, it's just me being more reflective, does a
Yep.
couple of things. One, it makes me more human because I'm much more creative and I'm also much more critical in my thinking because of the
Yep.
results. And then two is my communication patterns. I've realized that I wasn't a very good communicator before. I thought I was, but I'm not really, because
Yep.
you have to talk to it like a normal person. I gave the comparison the other day of if I went to an expert like you on whatever topic you're expert at, which is security, and all I said
Yep.
was, "Hey, make me a security program," and that's all I told you, you would give me
Yep.
a mediocre result because that's all I gave you. It's not your fault. It's
Yep.
my fault.
Yep.
But magically, because we're in this Google short form text thing, that we don't communicate that way. So it's forced us to be better at communication because the better you are
Yep.
communicating to, the better result you get. It's just crazy
Yep.
how that happens.
Yep. Yeah,
So
I think it makes something that I think about a lot is it makes everybody a manager, right? I have to think from a systems mindset. The best way to effectively give an LLM a standard operating procedure and give it
mhm,
the parameters that I want it to react to, just as if I was trying to coach somebody on my team, the parameters that I wanted to take them into account as they go and initiate a project for me or what have you. So I'm absolutely would second that. I think it makes me a much better communicator. I know
love
you
it.
ask about this later in the conversation, but like AI tools that we're using, I use one quite frequently called Lavender AI. I don't know if you've ever had
Uh,
Will Allred on the show. If you, okay, yeah, okay. So
Oh,
Lavender
I
AI
haven't had
actually,
Will. I know Lavender and I know Will. I just haven't had him on the show, but I will soon. But yeah, keep going.
okay, I can introduce you to him. He's a
Yeah.
buddy from college. But yeah, I use that tool all the time. And truly, I think it helps me be a much better communicator via email and written prose, right?
Yeah.
It essentially enforces fundamentals of breaking content up into digestible pieces and making it easy for the reader to consume. And so it teaches you in a way as you're interacting
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. That the concept I love about Liminal specifically is like your sell is you're selling generative AI. I'm like, I'll sell that because I love Gen
Yeah.
AI. It's like,
Yeah.
um, what I'd love to do is dive in more because again, the show is all about how AI makes business impact. And one thing that impressed me most
Yep.
about what you guys did is like when I was first talking to you, is you gave me the ebook around financial institutions using AI, and you had
Yep.
this business case full of. I was like, this is awesome. I'd
Yep.
love to have you tap in more of that. What obviously Liminal is a secure pathway to be able to employ the power of what Gen AI has, but what are you seeing as results, and why would anyone even want to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's, since we've created all of those use case documents, I think there's a bit of context that I'd like to provide here.
Sure.
So a lot of enterprises, I think, are only rolling out generative AI when they have a use case, right? And it's like traditional business logic. Hey, I only want to roll out a software or a new program if I can tie this to ROI. What this creates is a situation where you have these kind of, again, we're firewalling access to our frontline employees. So what these organizations are doing is they're then deputizing AI centers of excellence or governance committees or what have you to
Yep.
go find the highest value use cases of generative AI. So not too
I see.
dissimilar from what I passed to you.
Right.
And so inherent to those use cases that they bring back to cross the threshold of being high value, a lot of the use cases that these organizations are building into their backlogs, what I'm finding, these use cases, yes, are high value, but to be considered high value, they automate large components of business functions. To be able to automate large components of business functions, I have to talk to a lot of existing data. I have to talk to a lot of existing systems. There's a ton of stakeholders involved. And so when I flip the question back on these organizations and I say, this looks great. You have some really high powered use cases here. Are any of them implemented yet?
Mhm.
What do you think the answer is that normally comes back? The answer is almost,
Yeah.
oh no, we're POCing, we're kicking it around, we're POCing with another group, and it's always a
Yeah.
couple quarters out, couple quarters out, couple quarters out. And so the pitch at Liminal has actually shifted a bit in the past couple months, in that tying your generative AI deployments to hardline ROI and on a use case by use case basis, it can actually delay you quite significant, because it just takes, as I mentioned, it takes so much to POC and validate these things. And so where we're trying to shift the conversation is, the best way to get generative AI into the business is to start with what employees are already using. They're already using chat, right? They're already using ChatGPT, Gemini, Anthropic. They're already using embedded use cases of generative AI within applications. How can
Yeah.
we secure that first? Shift the conversation around from tying to dollar value ROI. Focus on user adoption first. There's plenty of studies out there showing if you get your users effectively using generative AI, they're going to be much more efficient. So then extrapolate the ROI after you have this tool actually in the hands of users. And I think that's a much more pragmatic way to get generative AI into business. Otherwise, as enterprises seem to be getting wrapped around the axle, are these actually our use cases? How do we implement these things? It's
Yeah.
much more straightforward to say, we just want to get generative AI in the hands of employees.
Do you think, and talk about adoption, because that's where I get nerding out on it, is because I read this interesting stat around OpenAI users, specifically around the paid version of ChatGPT, that almost half cancel after the first 1 or 2 months or something, because like we don't have any schooling on how the heck do you prompt and get good responses. So like people
Yeah.
prompt, like they prompt Google, and you
Right.
can't Google AI. So the results you get is crappy. Do you see that kind of thing happening as far as the adoption level, or like what are the teams doing to make sure that it's actually working when they have it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that we as an organization that are trying to be an accelerant to generative AI adoption in the enterprise, we're taking the stance that it is part of our responsibility to help educate people to use these tools effectively so that they don't have a negative experience with generative AI.
Yeah.
So when we're going into trainings in the enterprise, it is not uncommon for, many users in those trainings. This is the first time anybody's trained them how to use these tools. And so they're
Mhm.
having amazing responses and experiences using Liminal. And by the way, we're passing down to, say, GPT-4o or Claude 3.5 Sonnet or whatever it is. So we're not necessarily changing. The user could go out there and chat with those tools directly, but we are doing a better job of training them on how to use the tools. I do think it's really interesting that, like, you have this one moment of time to impress somebody when they're using a tool like this, or else they write it off. Good example of this, my wife actually, she is a tech forward previous technology executive of
Yeah.
herself in the payment space. So like a tech forward person. And I'm like, why aren't you using GPT for this? GPT-4 is great. And she just didn't like the response that's coming out of GPT. Claude releases an app, and all of a sudden she's, oh my God, Claude 3 is amazing. And she uses that all the time.
Right.
And so I think there is this new concept emerging of like the multi-model enterprise adoption of generative AI. I think a lot of businesses are maybe getting a false sense of security from a security standpoint of saying, we want to get generative AI into the business by just flipping the switch on Microsoft Copilot. And I think what they're not considering is, if I, as a user, don't like the responses coming out of Copilot, right? Maybe I've trained myself on my personal device how to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet or GPT-4o. If you're forcing me to use Copilot and I don't like that, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and get those
Go the other
models
ways.
on my own, right? And so I think that models will get better at having human sounding responses, or really interpreting where the user is at in their own AI readiness and
Right.
AI kind of training, to be able to maybe help them get a more human sounding response with fewer amounts of prompt engineering. Like, we're already seeing
Yeah.
that, I think. I
Yeah,
remember,
it's coming.
right when GPT 3.5 came out, there was a significant amount of prompt engineering to get that thing to sound like a human, or like I want it to. Now
Right.
these models out of the box sound really human with very little prompt engineering.
Yeah, you're talking about the 3.5 Claude. I've been geeking out on that thing. It's been so awesome. But like I've made some really cool, like to your point before, when it all first started, I was one of my mentors was a guy who was on some testing thing with OpenAI, and I didn't have any idea about it until ChatGPT came out, and he's the one who told me. So I signed up in November of whatever year it was,
Yep.
and I could not figure out. I could had a fun time prompting poems about cats in space. But I couldn't figure out
Yeah.
how to actually make it right. I had to do a lot of prompting to make it sound even remotely close. And now all I have to do is upload 1 or 2 LinkedIn posts maybe, and I can copy it
Yep.
just like that, and I only have to tweak 1 or 2 words and it's done. It's, like, crazy how
Yep.
good it is, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Tell me this, like how do I say this? From your view, what do most people get wrong about Gen AI in whatever use case?
Oh, this is interesting. So I already stated one of them, right? I think that the over indexing to use cases tied to ROI, I think that is something that at least as an enterprise, most people get wrong. I think I think from an individual, where do you want me to take the question or the answer? Do you want me to talk from an
Any way you
individual
want.
level or from an
Nope,
enterprise level? Okay.
all of it.
Um,
Individual and
okay.
enterprise. I want both. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I think that the biggest one in the enterprise is just getting too complex too quickly, right? I think that's the biggest misstep. And I can't fault the organizations really. I think as they're getting more sophisticated, what we're realizing is that this is not just a pitch into the chief information security officer,
Yep.
because this is, if you're making a choice to use Liminal as your way to get generative AI into the enterprise, you are in a way saying this is the platform that we want to use to enable, right? So you're making a choice not to use some other type of tool. And what that's creating is a situation where decision by committee, a lot of stakeholders are getting involved. And again, delayed deployments. And so I think the mistake there is not just trusting the employee to innovate on their own and find efficiencies on their own. From from an individual user basis, man, I would say it's like just not trying it. I
Yeah.
talked to a buddy of mine that I worked with at Deloitte as an analyst. Again, tech forward guy, has been in the startup ecosystem for a while now. He just made a job change out of his scale up startup into a much smaller organization. So they're creating a bunch of ground up content. And literally he was like, hey, I know no generative AI has been out there for a while, but it isn't until last week that he really started leaning in and using the tools. And his mind was
Right.
just blown. And I think that's the
Yeah.
biggest thing for a lot of people is just not understanding the capabilities and not treating it. I don't know, maybe I'm inherently like a tinkerer, but that was like the most,
Yeah.
I had genuine personal fun. If I could choose to play a video game or play around with generative AI, when it came out, I was like playing with generative AI and seeing what it could do. I
Yeah.
think tinkering more, finding out pushing the limits on it, finding what it can and can't do. That would be what I would say is like the first thing that a lot of people aren't doing is just your audience is doing it, but the vast user base is not.
You'd be surprised. Like I've done 4 trainings this week for 4 different audiences, and at least half of people said they dabble in it, but don't really use it all the time. And you get, probably 10, maybe 20%. They're like, use it daily. And then I have maybe 1 or 2 out of each group that said they're power users. So we're
Yep.
still on the cusp of people just saying, oh, it's cool, but I don't know why I'd use it all
Yep.
the time. And I'm like, I use this all day long, every day for everything.
Yes.
This is crazy.
I have another
Yeah.
good one for you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily like a what people are getting wrong, but it's something that I
That's
think
okay.
is, I think it's an opportunity that it's how I use generative AI when I'm not using it within Liminal, when I'm doing this for like personal use.
Mhm.
I think this is really interesting. So GPT 4.0, there's a feature in there where for the longest time, if I was in a tool, I could type the voice to text and
Yeah.
I could kind of voice prompt in and I'm seeing the prompt right in as I'm going. With GPT 4.0 now, when you click the little microphone icon and it just records, and I can record 5 minutes of me talking into the thing, and I don't have to be
Right.
making sure like it doesn't have a period in the right place or whatever. I
Right.
find myself much more frequently, like when I'm on a walk, walking the dog, or I'll just be like walking around my house and talking into this thing. I just provide it word vomit context on
Right.
everything that I'm thinking, all the decision
Right.
criteria, literally all the context around the decision as if I'm talking to an expert that I'm interviewing or a mentor. And what I'm finding in the latest release of GPT 4.0 is I think it is doing a much better job of digesting that kind of free form, unstructured content and making sense of it. Whereas again, let's go back to the GPT 3.5, like early releases of Chat GPT. A lot of the kind of education on prompt engineering was like, you have to tell it how to think, right? Like first I want
Yeah.
you to consider these factors and then this, and here's context. And you had to, whether you were dashing between different types of data types, whether it was structured data or unstructured data, it took a lot of effort. And now I'm letting it rip into the audio functionality and then I will send. And sometimes I'm using my phone to get all that context in, and then I'll pull it on my computer to actually so I start the thread in mobile and then I'll go on to GPT natively on my computer and kind of continue to
Yeah.
dial in from there. So I just think that voice recognition has been truly game changing. Also, I really like the audio functionality. I find myself, if I'm like driving to a business meeting, or again, I was
Yep.
driving to, I think I told you this before the call. I was at a VC kind of dinner last night. Before the thing, I took the email list that I was a part of. I copy and pasted that at 5 p.m. into a chat on my computer. When I was driving, I pulled up GPT-4o, started that thread, but in audio mode, plugged into my car. And then I just via voice, asked about those individuals who I was about to go meet with. And I just think that the multimodal functionality there is really powerful. I can burn an entire 30-minute drive and just educate myself as if I'm reading 10 blogs, but I'm doing it and it's only giving me the information I want when I want it. Right. So like, I think that's an
That's cool.
interesting, again, not something that somebody's getting wrong, but I think a big opportunity if people start to play with that functionality.
I love hearing that kind of thing, how people use it. Now, here's a question about Liminal, though. So,
Sure.
because you have Claude now on mobile and you have a ChatGPT on mobile, how does Liminal coincide with the mobile interface versus just computer?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now, the way that we handle the different instantiations of generative AI across an enterprise, there's chat, there's off-the-shelf applications. So that can be a desktop application or a web
Yeah.
application. And there's like developer use cases, right? So if a company is developing their own business workflow, either an internally facing business workflow, or it could be new feature functionality for a customer facing product, right? Those are like the three pillars that we protect in. We protect all of those differently. So for chat, we have a web application where you're actually in our tool. We'll connect to your identity provider. You can log in with single sign-on access. You chat there, right? So
Mm.
that's like the easiest way to start. And we are slowly but surely, I don't think we're ever going to be able to achieve true feature parity with OpenAI, with the level of funding that they have, et cetera. But I think that
Yeah.
we're slowly rolling in features that we find to be the most valuable features for enterprise users. And I think there will become a point in time over the next year or so where we have the bulk majority of those, right? Like we just in the past couple months released document upload. So that would be an example. Mobile is one of those ones that's on the roadmap that we haven't released yet. But there is a world where you have Liminal on your phone, and that is a
Yeah.
safe and sanctioned use case of generative AI, and you can log in through enterprise credentials. And the hope is that we'll have as much functionality as your business user needs to get the most out of it. There's definitely still ways, I don't know, you could talk into GPT-4o, get what it prints, and then copy and paste that into Liminal, and we would protect and secure anything that you put in
There you
there.
go.
So
Love it. That's cool. I have before we wrap up time, I have actually probably two more questions for you. So one is, I know the current state is you go after CISOs. Is that right now? The Chief Information Officer, is that right? Security Officer?
Chief Information Security Officer, that's right.
Yeah. Do you personally see a world where there's a lot of talk about chief AI officer? And so to me, I see two different sides of AI. I see the actual technical back end side, and then there's like the user adoption enablement, so to speak, side. So do you see in the future a department being created where you have one person that handles both sides of that for a company that both handles internal usage and external products? What do you think?
Yeah. So at least from my observation, I think the CISO was the catch-all ICP, ideal customer profile, early days, right? It's like they're the ones who are dealing with security. Even though generative AI is a workflow tool that adds
Mhm.
efficiency to the business, a lot of the decisions were at least being run through the CISO because they're the ones who are determining access. I rapidly see that changing where the CISO is a part of a much larger kind of decision-making process. And I think whether it's an AI, chief AI officer, I'm also like literally over the past, I call it month, I'm starting to hear about that more. In lieu of having a chief AI officer right now, a lot of organizations are again creating these centers of excellence that are a lot of different departments recommending people to be on this committee, and they're making decision as a committee. So I do think that there's probably in the near term going to be a chief AI officer. I don't know. I don't know if that lasts, right? Like I'm sure there are certain in the era of public cloud and cloud architecture and things of that nature, I'm sure there were specific roles called the chief cloud officer, et cetera. But now doesn't that all just roll up to the CIO? So there might just be a near term chief AI officer. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question of what differentiates for companies as it pertains to AI being rolled into their products. One school of thought is that AI is much more of like next version of Web 2.0, where there's certain parameters for what good user experience looks like, or what good tooling you're integrating into your web applications to make them consumable and usable by your audience. I think there's a world where AI kind of follows that trend. you don't have to specify that something is a SaaS application anymore, or it is a mobile application. If you're using business tooling, the assumption is that it's in the cloud. The assumption is that it probably has some mobile component. I think we see a lot of technologies in the near future in the near future, everybody's going to try and get as much as they can by putting AI on top of their business.
Right.
But I think it's just going to become table stakes, right? If you're not leveraging AI, it'd be like not leveraging natural language processing in your search functionality within your application, right? There's just certain
not
table
using
stakes
cloud
and
or not using electricity or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to specify, oh, it's an electronic, device. So everything uses AI, right?
Right. Yeah, that's cool. So a last question for you, and you're alluding to this. You didn't quite tell me, but you're alluding to this before, which is some of the things you're excited about with Liminal coming out soon. So if you can give us a scoop, what's coming you're excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we just raised a $5 million seed round. So that's exciting. I'm getting to build out my go-to-market team. Yeah, appreciate that. Having run my own company before this, there's been a lot of kind of individual contributor work where it's, okay, man, we're in the weeds now. We're running the play. We're not just building the play. We're running it.
Coaching and running it,
So, exactly. So the nature of my work is going to change, and what we can accomplish from a go-to-market team, I think is rapidly changing in the near future. Yeah, I think some of the stuff that we're like kicking around and testing out is different pricing models and different ways to get generative AI into large organizations. Whether we're packaging things up as, hey, flat rate fee and you get everything, versus is it a per seat model, versus are there some kind of PLG motions that we test with new funding? We're going to be able to, I think, test a lot of new and innovative ways to get into the enterprise. Don't want to commit to anything yet, but you'll be the first one that I'll notify if there's a PLG pathway to get your hands on Liminal. For all your users or your listeners, if you want to get your hands on Liminal, if you want to see what it's like, definitely reach out. Happy to demo you. We also offer an unpaid POC, which I've built out over the last month or two. That's been fun to say, hey, look, let's spin up a tenant for you and get this in the hands of your employees and actually test down a very thoughtful way to make sure that we're checking all the boxes from both a Gen AI enablement perspective, but also from a security perspective. You can get your hands on Liminal by reaching out.
Love it, man. I just want to say, first off, thank you, but make sure everyone knows where to go. It's Liminal, LIMINAL.ai. And then
Correct.
Are you okay if I attach your LinkedIn to the show notes and people can reach out to you? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Cool.
I would love that.
Awesome, man. I know I usually try to tell people that there's a demo, but because you talked about there's some options there, like I'll have them just reach out to you to see it, because I think it's cool stuff, man. I love being able to see for me, it's more of the larger view of what's happening in an org, what's going on, and also obviously just the security side. It's just phenomenal. I love it. I'm super excited for it. So
right
anyways,
on.
just want to say thank you, dude. Appreciate it.
Yeah, hey, I appreciate you for having me on, and excited to tell your listener base about secure generative AI in the enterprise. So definitely reach out, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
Sweet. Perfect, man. Well, thank you so much. We'll talk to you guys on the flip side.
All righty. Sounds good. Take it easy.
Thanks for listening to the GTM AI podcast. Please follow, subscribe, like, comment, and come back for more.